Hi, everybody. I'm Haynes. I'm an alcoholic.
Hello, Haynes.
Hey, my sobriety date is 8/8/87. Just to let you know, I'm one of the old farts in the program. But before I get this thing going, I would like to say how grateful I am to Steve and Todd for the daily ponderables and these Zoom meetings. I've recently been in a couple of areas where there are no meetings, or at least no English speaking meetings, and I'm not too good on foreign language, and very sketchy cell service. So these things are a real serenity saver for me when I'm traveling. So I appreciate all you guys being out there. Well, I'd also like to say how grateful I am to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the people of Alcoholics Anonymous, and my higher power for keeping me doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I guess I'm here because Stephen asked me to be here. So I'll go ahead and get cranked. Begin with, I was born into a very loving family in 1946. It was a little odd, but my father was born in 1899. My mother was born in 1902. I had two sisters that were born during the Roaring '20s, and I think I was kind of a post-World War II celebration. I don't think my parents were expecting another arrival, let alone a boy. After raising two girls, they had no idea what they were getting into. So I had my first sips of disaster from my prospective brother-in-law. My sister was dating a World War II vet, and he would come over to the house and have a beer or two with my mother, and I would run my little kitty car into his shins until he'd give me a sip of beer. So I got started fairly early with acquiring my taste for beer. Um, I was allowed in the family when there was parties going on to have a sip of beer every so often, and I was allowed a glass of champagne every Thanksgiving. And I think there was a little resentment that Thanksgiving only came once a year. So I started developing resentments early on in my life. I got my first fake photo ID on Broadway and 42nd at age 12, because the drinking age in New York was 18. At 12, I was about 5'10". So with my ID, I could buy beer. And that was, the start, I guess. My father was in the advertising business, and one of his accounts was National Distillers account. And they would send him a case of booze every month. And he would just put it in this big old storage closet for waiting for whenever they'd have a party, pull it out. And I was trading bottles of whiskey for 6 packs of beer because I liked beer. I never really drank whiskey, but I'd give it to my friends' older brothers, and they'd give me a 6 pack of beer. And I thought I was getting a good deal, and they knew they were getting a good deal. So I finally decided I better find out what's so good about this stuff. And I convinced two of my little friends to come out in the woods with me, and we mixed up a pint of whiskey sours and drank those. And they decided they'd had enough. They didn't like it, but there was still all the regular booze left in the bottle. And I decided I wasn't done yet, so I was going to show off, and I drank most of the rest of that bottle at age 12 and suffered the consequences. Was definitely under the weather for a while. Shortly after that, my father retired and moved to Florida. So I had another resentment built. He was taking me away from my drinking buddies. And as a result, I didn't have any friends in Florida. We were living in kind of a retirement community because my parents were older. And I kind of relished in isolating and worrying my parents that I was isolating. But sooner or later, I met somebody my age who was not one of us, not just to become one of us. He's a really good guy, but he introduced me to some other people who had promised for getting into the program. And the four of us started hanging out together and definitely getting into a few things that we shouldn't. I think I ended up in jail for drinking underage first time at age 15, 30 miles south of my hometown. So I was known to travel a little bit when I was drinking. So I went to my first real backwoods party. This was a real small town in Florida. And the first thing I saw were two young ladies really fighting. I mean, it was hair pulling and punching and gouging and kicking. And I'd never seen anything like that up in New York State. So I was pretty impressed with that. And then two guys got into it. And I mean, it was a real knockdown, drag out fight. So I thought, yep, this is my kind of town. I think I want to stay here. And my parents had other thoughts about that because the school system was made up with the people that I'd seen at the party. And they decided they wanted to send me off to boarding school. So another resentment, pulled out, no more parties, off to boarding school. I think the boarding school, probably the athletics and the academics 9 months out of the year saved my young liver because it was, I was definitely, when I was home for 3 months in the summer, I'd get jobs, odd jobs, enough to get some spending money. And you know what I spent it on was partying. So we got our driver's licenses in Florida back then at age 16. And my parents, we were only a one-car family. My parents had this little Ford Falcon with the smallest six-cylinder, I think, ever made by Detroit. So there was another resentment. This is what I had to drive. But I was out driving around with one of my friends who had a 64 Ford Galaxy with a 390 and a 4-speed on the thing. And he decided that he had too much to drink and that I was in better shape than he. So he asked me to drive. So the four of us took off in his car. But all I remember was getting in the driver's seat on a causeway going out to the beach. And then the next thing I really remembered was being parked in the middle of one of my friend's front yards with his parents wondering what I was doing there. And I had absolutely no recollection. So, and I thought someone was pulling a joke on me. I thought I got behind the wheel and gone to sleep and they pulled me over. But we heard stories. People saw us 30 miles north in Vero Beach and 20 miles south in Jupiter, and they said we were out of control. And so I guess that was probably my first blackout. But after boarding school, I went off to college. I was lucky enough to go to college. My great aunt had left a little kitty for me to have enough money to go. For spending money, I got $67 a month from Social Security because my father was retired. And there wasn't anything really unusual about my college career other than, again, I would wake up in places that I'd always wanted to go, but would have no memory of how I got there. So it was beginning to establish a pattern. It wasn't terribly good. And like all college careers, there were a few romances, but I was a biology major, so I was quite sure it was nothing but hormones and shapes and sizes and things like that. So I never really paid too much attention to them until my senior year when I fell madly in love with a young lady. I'd never experienced anything like this. This was kind of a shock. And we got quite close. I got very close to her family. Her father was a World War II vet. He'd been the XO on the infantry unit that held the bridge at Remagen. So he had quite a history. But anyway, I got towards the end of my senior year, was going to graduate, called my parents to tell them for sure when graduation was and where to go and stuff like that. My father said, "Oh, did you hear about Clifford?" And I said, "No, Clifford was one of my best drinking buddies. Always seemed to know when I was coming into town, and he and I got into trouble together quite often." And I said, "No," I said, I'll give him a call after I get off the phone. He said, "Oh, you can't call him." He said, "He was trying to call you last week, but we told him you were in exams and we didn't give him your phone number." I said, "Well, I'll call him." And he says, "No, you can't do that. He shot himself." So I instantly thought, oh, if I'd only known, I could have saved him, the great savior. And then another resentment because my father had not given him my phone number. So these things, hung around in the back of my mind. So anyway, when my parents came up to see the graduation, I'd been thinking, and this was 1969. So what would have happened to me when I got out of college? I would have been drafted. And all of my good friends from the little town of Florida had already been drafted. Most all of them had gone to Vietnam. And I wasn't really sure I wanted to do that, but I was sure I wanted a little bit of vacation So after the graduation ceremony, I told my parents I'd see them sometime, loaded all my stuff in the back of my girlfriend's Volkswagen and drove her home to Cleveland, Ohio to meet her parents again. And then from there, they had a summer place on Pelee Island, which is the southernmost part of Canada. And I figured I would be safe out on the island from the draft, but to be legal, I had a sister in Flint, Michigan, who had been widowed the year before. She had 5 kids. So I told the Flint draft board that I was going to come up and take care of my sister and switch it over. So 2 weeks after I graduated, my parents back in Florida got my preliminary draft notice, but I could call them and say, nope, I'm legal in Michigan. So I got at least 3 months worth of vacation before they caught up with me. And I did have my first preliminary draft physical in Detroit, and then switched my draft board back to Florida and got another 3 weeks, another 3 months vacation. I got drafted December '69. So my Army career started off with, as you can imagine, a little something to do with alcohol. We were in a reception barracks that was supposed to be isolation. You weren't supposed to be around other people for a while to make sure you didn't have any communicable diseases or anything like that. And I looked way down the road from our little reception barracks, and I could see this blinking sign going 1, 2, 3. And I asked one of the guys, "What's 1, 2, 3?" And I said, "Oh, that's the club for the private E1, private E2, and private first class." Well, I was a private E1, so I figured that was where I was supposed to go. So I wandered off down the road, got a big 16-ounce Dixie cup full of beer, and was walking out of the club looking over my shoulder to make sure nobody was going to catch me, and ran into our senior drill sergeant and spilled beer all over his nicely starched uniform. So he looked at my uniform and saw the name tag and says, "Johnson, are you and me going to have trouble?" And, "Oh, no, drill sergeant, not me." But that was the start. So I had, since I'd had 4 years of college, they wanted me to go to OCS. And I did not want to go to OCS because that favorite brother-in-law that gave me the beer when I was 1 had been in Princeton when World War II broke out. And he was a lot smarter than I was. And he didn't want to be an officer because he didn't know anything about the military. So I politely refused OCS. And then they came back at me and wanted me to go to NCO school. And the brother-in-law ended up as a buck sergeant E5. So I thought, okay, I could do the NCO school. So I got to stay in the States for a whole year and get lots and lots of training in just about anything you can think of. I always liked making loud noises when I was a kid. So I ended up in artillery, and I got training in explosives and mines and everything else. And just, I was in my element. So then I had, after the year in the States, I had 1 year in Vietnam that was, had its ups and its downs. As you may well imagine, I got to see some really pretty country and made some incredible friends. You know, foxhole buddies are with you for life. My best foxhole buddy that I shared a lot of foxholes with lives just a little north of us, and I try to see him once or twice a year. So we keep up with him. But anyway, one of the examples of how alcohol possibly has an effect on my judgment is one I use with the guys I work with in a rehab center here. I just give it as an example that towards the end of my 1 year in Vietnam, I was sent to a rear area because that's what they did with people. They tried to get you away from any kind of unpleasantries. So I was sent 60 miles south to our base camp to watch over our heroin addict population. We had about 10% of my gun battery was addicted to heroin. And so I figured, okay, you know, job's a job. So I went back, and every morning I'd radio into my unit up north and say, you know, all present accounted for, everybody's still alive. And that was going to go on until I went home, supposedly. One afternoon, I was sitting drinking my nickel beer, and this little private's sitting there snorting his heroin, and he's looking at me. And I said, "What's your problem?" And he says, "Well," he says, "tell you what, you're a sergeant, you're drinking beer, that's legal. I'm a private, I'm doing heroin, you could turn me in. I said, so what do you want me to do? He says, here, try some of this stuff. So I thought about it, but after having a few beers, I figured, well, I'm in a really rear area. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Sure, I'll try some of that stuff. So I snorted up some of his 95% pure heroin, and I did not like it. I can tell you that I got numb. I couldn't find my way back to my bunk. The next morning, I'm throwing up green slime, and I radio in to my unit up north, and they say, well, we had a little trouble up here. We need you to come back up and run your gun section. So, oh dear, got a Jeep, got a driver, and headed up the road. And as I pull in the battery area up north, everybody's lined up at the urinal giving urine samples. And I'd had 2 years unblemished by anything major. And I was thinking, you really done it now? Because an NCO being detected with heroin in their system was not a ticket to rehab back in those days. It was a dishonorable discharge. And if I was lucky, if I wasn't lucky, I'd end up in Leavenworth. So anyway, I got in line. I was the last one in line because everybody else had been lined up before me, and they were happy to see me. All the guys thought I'd go back and they'd never see me again. So when I got up to pee, I got 110 guys standing around me chanting pee, 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 and clapping in unison. And it's hard enough to pee in public, but with 110 guys standing around you clapping and asking you to pee, it was really hard. And I didn't want to pee anyway. But if any of you have seen the old TV series MASH, there was a guy called Major Flagg, who was a CID, Criminal Investigation Division. And he was in charge of this thing. He'd flown in a little helicopter to take urine samples. So he looks at me and says, Sergeant Johnson, you either pee in that bottle or I'm going to put you on that helicopter and you're going back to headquarters with me until you do pee in that bottle. And my captain stood up for me and said, Major, he says, Sergeant Johnson might drink a little bit too much sometimes, but I know he doesn't do drugs. So he said, the Major says, if you sign an affidavit, he can stay. So I was that close to ruining the rest of my life just because my judgment was slightly impaired from drinking beer. So anyway, got to finish up north, got to go home, came home on Thanksgiving Day, 1971, and had Thanksgiving in Fort Lewis, Washington before dawn, had a Thanksgiving dinner at my girlfriend's house in Fort Myers, Florida, and then a Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house over in Stuart, Florida. So that was 3 Thanksgivings, and I was reasonably thankful to be home. And I settled into my own old routine of hanging out at the local watering hole and driving test boats, which had been a summer job during the summer. And shortly after that, a young lady from Australia, I forgot to mention that in Vietnam, they did let you take vacations every so often. You're supposed to get 1 week for every year you're in country. Well, our battery clerk was just like Radar O'Reilly in MASH. And if he liked you, you were golden. If he didn't like you, you were in serious trouble. He got me 3 R&Rs out of country that 1 year. And I ended up in Australia and had met a young lady who wanted to get married. And I said I was much too young to get married and really didn't have much interest in it. But I said, if you're ever in the States, be sure to look me up, because I figured, Australia is a long way from Florida, so the chances of her showing up were pretty slim. Well, a couple of weeks after I got home, guess who showed up on our doorstep? It was a young lady wanting to get married from Australia. And that was, what could I do? I had her stay. My parents had a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, so I was moved out onto the screened-in porch and settled in. And for some reason, my father decided to shoot himself shortly after that. And my old girlfriend from college loved my father dearly, but she wouldn't go to his funeral because I had the young lady from Australia living there. So I could sort of understand that. But then a week later, her father shot himself. And since she hadn't gone to my father's funeral, I wouldn't go to her father's funeral. So that kind of ended that relationship a little bit. But the young lady from Australia decided I was not going to marry her. She moved on. She had another prospect in Texas, and she did marry him so she could stay in the States. That was the main mission she had. Just to give you an example of how a young alcoholic to be's mind worked, when my mother came out and gave me a big hug and said he's gone, telling me about my father saying he shot himself, my thought wasn't, oh, that's terrible. I'm going to miss him so much, or it's so terrible. My mother's been with him for 60 some years. This is my thought was, who's going to take care of her now? Because I wanted to get out and get on with my life. So, one of the little selfish alcoholic characteristics raised its ugly head. And my mother got back at me a little bit later, because her comment to me was, in the old days, sometimes children left home and never saw their parents again, which was sort of a subtle hint for me to get on the road and get on with my life. So from there, I did get a job commensurate with my education. I was designated a marine biologist by the Florida Department of Natural Resources and moved to the fabulous Florida Keys, which was great because the bars down there didn't close till 5 a.m. I had a boss in Tallahassee, which was 900 miles away, and I only had to see him once a year, whether I needed to or not. So I was kind of on my own. I had my own state car, my own state boat, my own state diving equipment, and I worked at my own pace, which I would work frantically, for a couple of weeks at a time without taking weekends off. My boss knew it. And then he'd let me take 3 or 4 days off so I could really tie one on. So that was the start of my career. And it was probably the best job I'll ever have. But after a couple of years, I got a phone call late one night from a boarding school buddy's wife. I'd kept up with him. I'd visited them. He was the first one in our class to get kicked out of boarding school and had married fairly young and had 3 kids. But I thought his wife said, "Can we come down and visit?" And I said, "Sure." I had a 1-bedroom, 1-bath apartment, and I didn't know where I was going to put everybody, but sure, why not? Come on down. And promptly went to sleep, forgot all about the phone call, went out fishing the next morning and came back, and she was sitting on my doorstep with just her, with one of her husband's cars, a duffel bag that contained some clothes and 7 pounds of her husband's dope. Her husband was a minor drug dealer, and she had run off, left her husband and the 3 kids. She'd run off with a major drug dealer to Fort Lauderdale. And he found out he was going to get raided, didn't want her to get mixed up in the raid. So he says, "Isn't there a safe place you can go?" And she said, "Well, I've got my husband's got a friend down in the Keys." So that was the phone call that she was calling me to come hide out from what was going on in Fort Lauderdale. So she came down, and I convinced her that she really ought to give her husband's car and the dope back and get on with her life. And we found out he was in Florida looking for not her so much as the dope in the car, but found out where he was and sent her on her merry way. And I went back to work, and I got a radio call. I had a law enforcement radio in my state car saying, "Do you know a Susan Johnson?" I says, "Yeah." The dispatcher says, "Well, she says she had an accident over in Fort Myers, and she's coming in on a flight on midnight tonight. She needs you to pick her up at the Miami airport." So I went down to Miami airport, and she'd run her little Volkswagen into a semi going across the Tamiami Trail. And back then the cops didn't check personal effects, so she got to keep her dope, got that back to her husband, and then came back and needed a place to recuperate. So she moved in with me, and I decided that was probably a match made in heaven. Anybody that would run off, leave their husband and 3 kids with a drug dealer must be who I needed to marry. So eventually we got married. and she was sure she would never see her kids again. But shortly after that, her husband had problems with his girlfriend to the point that he had to get rid of the kids. So he sent the kids down to live with us. So I went from bachelorhood to married with three daughters aged 6, 5, and 3 fairly quickly. And I'm not sure how the young ladies put up with their mother and me for our career, but they did. They all turned out really well, all amazingly. So, but anyway, on to more recent history where I had been doing geographical cures, moving slowly northward, and first ended up from the Keys, ended up in Miami, and then West Palm, and then Stewart, and Jacksonville. And in Jacksonville, my disease was really starting to pick up. I was not doing well. I was last year in Jacksonville. I was 40 years old. I had gout. My blood pressure was 160 over 100 with heavy medication. I couldn't get any lower than that. I could barely walk up a flight of stairs. And the job I was in was getting more and more difficult. So I had a job offer in Atlanta and decided that would be a good thing to get out of Dodge, get out of Jacksonville, go to Atlanta. And I had a new doctor in the move. And for some reason, I was a little honest with him about how much I was drinking. He could tell pretty much from my blood test, his liver function's not too good. But instead of telling me I was an alcoholic or that I drank too much, he said, I think you're allergic to alcohol. And I never heard that concept before. So I could live, I'm a biologist, right? I understand allergies. There's strawberry allergies and shellfish allergies. So I said, okay. He says, well, I want you to taper off on your drinking and taper off on your blood pressure medication and come back and see me in a week. Well, I came back in a week and I didn't go through DTs. I was not that far gone. I got a little shaky and definitely cranky. But after a week, my blood pressure without medication was down to 120 over 80. So I said, yeah, okay, I'm sure maybe I do have this allergy, and I understand if you drink a little too much, it's not good for your liver, but I understand your liver will regenerate if you treat it well. So, okay, I said, I'll quit drinking. And I was dry for a week, 10 days, and I was on a phone call with an associate back in Florida. And for no reason at all, at the end of the phone call, I said, Marie, I quit drinking about a week ago and I feel really pretty good. And she said, that's great, Haynes. How are you going to stay stopped? I said, stay stopped? What do you mean stay stopped? I never heard that term before. And she says, well, I have to go to meetings to not drink. And I've known her for 30 years. 20 years before she was out partying, raising hell with the rest of us. And then she kind of dropped off the social scene. So I figured her liver wore out earlier than mine. But anyway, she says, no, I have to go to AA meetings to not drink. And I was absolutely floored because, my concept of an alcoholic, some of my big brothers had developed real alcoholism or lived under park benches, and they were not pretty sights. But here was a professional woman, very attractive, very intelligent, who said she was an alcoholic. So anyway, that kind of planted in the back of my mind that, all alcoholics do not live under bridges. And then went back. I was still not drinking after 2 weeks. And my former spouse, first wife, decided she did not like me dry. And I came home from being out canoeing and she laid into me. We had a moment of what I choose to call truth and consequences. And she told me what a rotten husband I was and how worthless I was and how great her boyfriend was and how she wanted me out of the house and all this kind of stuff. And she sobered up about halfway through that and realized she probably said stuff she shouldn't have said. So she says, I think I've got a problem. I want you to take me down to the local hospital and check me into the A&D program down there. So 2:30 in the morning, I drove her down and checked her into a 30-day alcohol and drug rehab thing and went home to contemplate what my options were. And, nobody in my family had ever been divorced. I had this great family. I was thinking, my God, this is going to be a terrible example for, my nieces and nephews and the little kids. And what am I going to do? And I think I remember saying, good God, what am I going to do? And he didn't answer, didn't give me a word. But 3 days later, I got a call from my first wife from the hospital, and she read the big book, done her fourth and fifth step, was leading meetings in the hospital, and she was cured. She was coming home. So I went down to pick her up, and the only requirement she had when she signed out of the hospital was that she go to a meeting in the hospital on the way out. And it was August in Georgia, and it was hot in the parking lot. I didn't want to sit out in the parking lot, so I figured I'd just sit in the back of the air-conditioned cafeteria and stay cool and figured nobody would notice me. Well, they noticed me. And, it said, anybody here for their first meeting? And I said, hi, I'm Haynes. I'm an alcoholic, which I thought, well, this is a lie, but I don't want to tell them I'm not an alcoholic because they're liable to throw me out. I got to go sit in the parking lot and get hot. So that was the beginning of the meeting. Then the end, when they're trying to give out chips, the guy up there's giving out the white chip. He says, this is tried our way of living one day at a time. Is anybody out there willing to take a white chip? And he'd hold it out in my direction, and I'd look the other way because I knew if I accepted something from him, they would want something from me. And that's the way it worked. You're not going to suck me in like that. So the meeting was over, we went home, and my lovely first wife explained to me that, no, that's the way it worked in AA. If you take a chip, you don't have to do anything. So I decided, well, maybe this would help me allow my liver to heal if I went to meetings, and definitely keep my wife off my back. So I started going to meetings and not paying a whole lot of attention, but I went to meetings for a while. And forgot to mention earlier that besides the physical problems, I was having real mental problems. I was having serious psychotic thoughts. I mean, to the point where I could understand how mass murders happen and a lot worse stuff. And my wife, we'd be driving into work, commuter together, and she'd look over and see me thinking, and what are you thinking about? And I'd look at her and smile and say, oh, you, sweetie, you, but I wouldn't be thinking about terrible, terrible things. So anyway, after maybe 2-3 months in the program, I woke up one morning and realized these thoughts were gone. I had not made any conscious effort to get rid of them, but they were gone. So I thought about the second step that talked about higher power restoring our sanity. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. You think this is one of those coincidences that has cleaned my little brain a little bit. So I said, okay, I kept coming. And then I decided I was really feeling a whole lot better and beginning to believe that maybe I had a problem with alcohol, and maybe I ought to stay in AA. And if I did stay in AA, I had to get a sponsor. So I looked around my first home group and I realized I knew who I wanted to be my sponsor. It looked like a giant Charlie Manson, great big, wild, been a street drunk and a heroin addict on the streets of Atlanta for years. Had sobered up and helped a lot of young guys get sober, but I didn't know how to ask him. So I had graduated from cleaning ashtrays to cleaning the big group coffee pot. And I had the coffee pot in a little one-person bathroom, scrubbing it out. And I says, okay, God, how do I ask this guy to be my sponsor? And I'm waiting for an answer, something to bubble up out of the toilet or a voice come out of the sink, but nothing, absolutely nothing. So I thought, oh, this is a crock of crap, just like everything else. I opened that door and took one step out of that bathroom, and that guy came up and put his hand on my shoulder and says, I want to talk to you. The hair still stands up on my arms. And, I always believed in coincidences, but that was just a little bit too much. So I started working the steps with him and did okay with 1, 2, 3. And then we got to 4, 5. And my father had always told me, never put anything in writing you don't want published in the newspaper. So I didn't want to do a 4-step because I didn't want to publish that in the newspaper. And I used that as an excuse. And he finally took me aside after a meeting. He says, look, Haynes, he says, if you don't do your 4th and 5th step, I'm going to kill you and commit suicide. And with him, you never knew if he was serious. So I went ahead and did my 4th and 5th step. And then he sent me home after the 5th step to do 6 and 7 quietly. And I was ready. I was ready to have God remove them. And I humbly asked him, I said, please get rid of these things. Certainly didn't get rid of all of them, but I'm still working on it. Then for 8 and 9, I remember the go to any lengths for the program. And the young lady from college was still back up in Canada. So I went from Georgia to Canada to make amends. And my sponsor grilled me for quite a long time to make sure my motives were correct in going up to seeing her, because she was married to a chief of police and he did not want me intruding improperly up there. So I got that done and came back to Georgia and started working on 10, 11, and 12. And that was kind of the beginning of my Serenity. So I, was really beginning to enjoy the program. So I think my first service work that I didn't actually know was service work, we used to take a meeting down to Grady Hospital, which is a state-run hospital, mainly for the street people. And it's one of the top trauma centers in the country. But anyway, we'd go down there once a week and bring coffee and donuts for the street people. And we'd have meetings. And going back out to my first home group, I told the old guru that I was really sorry I didn't have much to add because I didn't know the program as well as he did. And he said, son, he says, we're old and we got the program down pat. We talk bumper stickers and quote the big book. And these guys are a little suspicious. They think we're snake oil salesmen. So you, on the other hand, still look pretty rough around the edges, but they can see that you are actually making an effort to quit drinking. So you are contributing. That is actually service work. And got into canoeing. Whitewater canoeing was my outlet. My first sponsor told me I really needed to have the program, work, and some kind of recreation. So I chose whitewater canoeing. And my former spouse did not like whitewater canoeing. So between me being dry and going off canoeing, she decided she'd had enough and she basically ejected me from our happy home. So I ended up in downtown Atlanta, sharing an apartment with a friend down there. And he was a kayaker. And he told me about a group going up to the Nantahala Outdoor Center. And on a weekend, I went up and met 2 young ladies who were drinking coffee instead of drinking beer. And we kind of hung around together for part of the weekend. And finally, one of them, or maybe it was me, let a bumper sticker slogan slip. And it turned out they were 2 young ladies with almost 3 years in the program. And I was impressed. I didn't have a year in the program, but I was definitely interested. But the one I was interested in, I made an agreement with her therapist that she was not to date married men and she was not to date anybody who didn't have a blue chip. So she and I canoed together for the rest of my year. And while I was still married, and I got my divorce papers and my first year chip pretty much in the same week. And that was the beginning of a really great relationship. She introduced me to a lot of guys in the program in downtown Atlanta, got me doing all kinds of service work, and really set me on the proper road before we became a couple. I got to be a GSR and worked workshops, and that right after the first year, my first sponsor went back out, and I was pretty devastated by that. I got my first sponsee, then he went out, and I was pretty devastated by that. But I got a new sponsor, and he and the other people in my home group helped me through that. Let's see, I moved out of Atlanta and had all kinds of activities on the fringes of Atlanta. Marietta, Georgia's got a big roundup every year. It's a pretty big deal. Yeah, Denise and Tom have been to that. And I got to help out with the International Convention in Atlanta. That was really an eye opener there. And then I got to retire and moved up to the hills of North Georgia, where Clarity and I hang out quite a bit, and had well, besides I didn't have work to balance my program with anymore, so I started being of service to things other than program things. I got involved with a bunch of nonprofits and did volunteer work, and we got to take a meeting into the jail, which they'd fought for years, but we got in there till COVID hit, and that drove us out of the jail. When COVID was over, they didn't want us back in the jail for some reason. So about that time, a rehab center showed up in town. So I got to work in the rehab center on an amazing regular basis. And actually, one of the guys that was in the rehab center came up to me after his first meeting there and says, "I know you. You were in the jail meetings. I was in one of your meetings in the jail." So I got to work with him, and he's been out of rehab for close to 2 years now, and he's doing great. I'm trying to think of other stuff. Was doing service work in our district. Clarity invited Stephen to be a speaker at our district picnic, and he accepted and came down, and my wife and I were lucky enough to host him at our house, so I got to spend a whole night talking with him, and so grateful that I got to meet somebody that, because I take the daily ponderables wherever I travel and pass them off in odd meetings in odd places. So if you do see strange people showing up, it's partly because of me. And then back to the stepdaughters I had, they did all turn out well. They all grew up well. And this last weekend, I had 2 of the 3 granddaughters. The oldest stepdaughter repeated her mom's trick and had 3 daughters. And the daughters would not talk to their mom. Their mom went back out shortly after I moved out, and never got it. And she died alone, unattended, of our disease fairly recently. I was the only one that in the family that would talk to her, and that's because I drive people crazy. One of my favorite passages is during our review of the night, "Were we kind and loving toward all?" And you got to be kind and loving toward ex-spouses, or you're not following the big book. So anyway, they were all up here with their boyfriends, hanging out and having a great time. So life is unbelievable in this program. I mean, it's so much better than just good. I can't stand it, and it's been very difficult to not go on and on as old farts do. But I'm going to call it a night and say that's the biscuit. Thank you very much. So